Welcome again, friends, to another morning of satsang. And we are back again to the Holy Science by Swami Sri Yukteswar Giri. And I'm actually quite excited for today because this is one of those parts of the book that I've been looking forward to since I started. There are some parts of the book, I have to be honest, I was not looking forward to because it's far too esoteric or quite beyond my comprehension. But here, as you know, we have been looking at chapter 3 of the Holy Science, which is the chapter called Procedure. And as I was sharing earlier, this is a chapter on yoga. So we looked at Sankhya, we looked at Vedanta, and now we are looking at yoga. That's the sequence of how we want to approach our spiritual life based on these 3 systems of philosophy. And this particular section of the book is very, very interesting, as you will see. I've been looking forward to it because it's not as esoteric and it's very, very practical, and in fact, I should say scientific. Yukteswar Giri just tells us what we should do and why he has arrived at these conclusions, and it's just the most practical part of this book. Both this part and again next week also, this particular section of the book on yoga is very, very helpful, and I've been reading and thinking about it more and more this past week because I was going to talk about it on this particular morning. So, without further delay, we are doing sutras 9 to 11 of chapter 3 of the Holy Science, and I'm not going to read the Sanskrit, I'm going to read just the English translation of these verses. Moral courage is strengthened by observance of niyama, morality or self-control, and niyama, religious rules. So that's all he says. There's more. Yama comprises of non-injury to others, truthfulness, non-stealing, continence, and non-covetousness. Niyama means purity of body and mind, contentment in all circumstances, and obedience. And in brackets he says, following the instructions of the Guru. Essentially, both this verse and even the upcoming verses, he just goes back to the basics. He goes back to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and gives essentially the definition of yoga itself. And obviously, as Patanjali also does, he starts with yamas and niyamas, the right ways of living. And that's what we are going to discuss in the chapter, the natural way of living. In the last session of this particular satsang, we were discussing the natural love of the heart, what is natural to our own heart. And in this particular section, we are going to discuss natural living. And Yukteswar Giri does not even explain a whole lot of what the verses are, but rather just gives a 3 or 4 page, let me see, actually 6 or 7 page explanation. Well, let's see. Actually 9-page explanation on what is right living. I would recommend you to just read these 9 pages. These are pages 62 to 70. So all these pages, I would recommend you to read it because there is really not a lot of philosophy or abstract philosophy in any of these verses. They're simply the ways of right living. He explains what it means to adhere to yamas and niyamas, what it means to live right spiritual life, or in his own words, what is natural living. I'm going to read sections of this particular passage, these pages, and I'm just going to briefly comment on them. Obviously, I don't have time to read all of this explanation. I'll move on to the second paragraph on page number 62. What is natural living? To understand what natural living is, it will be necessary to distinguish from what is unnatural. Living depends upon the selection of food, dwelling, company. So these are the 3 categories that we are going to look at in terms of right living. So Yukteswar divides right living into 3 categories, which are right food, right dwelling, and right company. Now, he says a lot more here, but I'm going to skip and I'm going to go right into food. In the section on food, Yukteswar Giri writes, he discusses many different ways in which he has arrived at this conclusion. And basically, to cut to the chase, he says that humans are meant to survive primarily on fruits and maybe nuts and a few grains. He says later he expands that selection, but he calls us frugivorous. I've never heard that word before. Of course, he wrote this book in the 1800s, so I'm assuming he was not making up this word. It's just not part of my vocabulary, but it's of course pretty self-evident what it's talking about. He says humans are not just herbivorous, we are frugivorous animals, because herbivorous animals are animals like cows or deer that basically eat anything that's green, that are living off of leaves, whereas we don't live off of leaves. We actually eat the mature products of the plants. We don't just go and chew on leaves from trees and plants, but rather we eat the produce from those plants. So that he calls frugivorous. So I'm going to read, and he gives 3 different kinds of observation based on which he arrives at this conclusion, which I have to say are pretty irrefutable. He gives a very, very logical, a very sound explanation for why he considers this way of living natural. First, I will read the first paragraph of what is natural food. First, to select our natural food, our observation should be directed to the formation of the organs that aid in digestion and nutrition, the teeth and the digestive canal, to the natural tendency of the organs of sense which guide animals to their food, and to the nourishment of the young. So he has 4 different categories based on which he is going to arrive at what is natural food. And these 4 different criteria that he gives, because he invites all of us, that's what yoga is. Yoga is a science. He invites all of us to explore these 4 criteria, these 4 ways of analyzing, and then through this distinct 4 ways of analysis, he arrives at this conclusion that he's presenting for us. The first one is observation of our teeth. And he says, by observing the teeth of the carnivorous animals, I'm just briefly reading some of the points. I'm not going to read word by word. The canines are of striking length, smooth and pointed to seize the prey. The molars are also pointed. These points, however, do not meet, but closely fit side by side to separate the muscular fiber. I'm just so impressed. This was a book that came from pure intuition and inspiration, and he's so precise both in his scientific analysis and its presentation. He says the molar teeth, the human molar teeth fit. The way these 4 teeth on the either side of the mouth, it's like a mold that fits on top of each other. The carnivorous animals don't have teeth like that, because if you have teeth, this is for chewing, whereas animals that are eating other animals, they have to tear the muscular fibers. So even their molars are pointed. And he says, the canines are of striking length, smooth and pointed to seize the prey. They have longer canine teeth that are able to seize the prey, bite into an animal and to kill it. And then he moves on to herbivorous animals like deers, cows, and other animals that eat plants. In herbivorous animals, the incisors are strikingly developed, the canines are stunted. The molars are broadly topped and furnished with enamel on the sides only. Again, then there's no enamel on the top. I'm impressed with how fine his scientific observation is. I don't know if he studied any zoology or whether he actually studied the human body in any formal discipline, but of course he's so precise in how he states these scientific facts and how helpful it is for us to understand the right nature of food. He says the canines are stunted, and in brackets he says, though occasionally developed into weapons as an elephant. So elephants have large canines, tusks that are developed, but they're weapons. They're not meant, they have no functionality as far as food consumption is concerned. Again, he's distinguishing how, even if you were to say humans were just like the herbivorous animals meant to eat plants, that's not true, because even they have a different anatomy that is meant for consuming and digesting plants. In the frugivorous, all teeth are of nearly the same height. The canines are little projected, conical and blunt, not meant for seizing prey or for exertion of strength. The molars are broad topped and furnished at the top with enamel folds to prevent waste caused by their side motion, but not pointed for chewing flesh. So it is very hard for our molars to chew flesh. That's why humans don't eat raw flesh, or they don't tear into hard muscular fibers. When humans eat meat, it's fully cooked and it's in small portions. They're not tearing it. They're using a spoon and fork and doing all the work with their hands before actually putting it in their mouth. And he goes on, in omnivorous animals, on the other hand, the incisors resemble those of herbivores, the canines those of the carnivores, and the molars serve twofold purpose. Again, he gives even more detailed explanation of all of this. Basically, this is the conclusion that he draws. The reasonable inference, therefore, is that man is a frugivorous or a fruit-eating animal. And then he says, by fruit, he's not just saying that we should only eat apples and bananas. He says, fruit comprises any part of plant life useful to man. The fruitarian diet referred by Yukteswar Giri includes vegetables, nuts, and grains. So, fruits basically means where the plant stores its energy, not the body of the plant, but the produce of the plant. So, because it's, just think of the word fruit as the English meaning, not just the fruit that you can pluck from a tree, but the fruit of an action, the fruit of an organism. That's what the fruit is. So, in a rice plant, that's a grain. In a different plant, it might just be a vegetable. In another plant, it might be a ripe fruit like an apple or banana. So all of this is fruitarian diet. Now, I'm going to move on. The second criteria, I want to continue and finish all of this in this particular class. Observation of the digestive canal. Again, I'm not going to read everything he says. There's a lot of scientific facts in here, but he says, in carnivorous animals, it's a long digestive canals that goes through their mouth. The bowels of herbivorous animals are 20 to 28 times the length of their body, and their stomach is extended and has a very compound build. Whereas we, humans, have bowels that are only 10 to 12 times the length of the body, and their stomach is somewhat broader than that of carnivorous and has the continuation in the duodenum serving the purpose of a second stomach. Essentially, in brief, the carnivorous animals don't have a long digestive canals because they're not trying to break down and process the meat to the extent to which it has to be done with plants in order to absorb the nutrients. The herbivorous animals have a very, very, very long canal because they have to go through the bowels a lot in order to digest, to press the food and get all the nutrients out of it. The frugivorous animals is somewhere in between the two, man, where the length of his bowel is about 10 to 12 times the length of his body, and it's somewhere in between the carnivorous, the omnivorous, and the herbivorous animal because it's exactly meant for digesting the fruits of the plants. So, this is exactly the formation we find in the human anatomy, which says that human bowels, well, I'm going to skip those sentences. I'll just read the conclusion where he says, we again draw the inference that man, in all probability, is a frugivorous animal. I'm going to move on. Observation of the organs of senses. Again, this is a very, very interesting way of even looking at it. He says how we are drawn to certain things. Just think about it. I hike a lot and I look at sometimes fruits or other things in nature and immediately I want to pick some and eat. I was recently in Ananda village, which is where, this is the global headquarters of Ananda, and it was summertime and there were a lot of blackberry bushes. And I found myself walking on these pathways. It's a fairly rural community and there's a lot of forested areas. And blackberry in California, where I live, is a wild invasive species. So you will find a lot of it in forests also. So I was watching all these wild blackberry plants that were all ripe and so perfect for harvest. I didn't even have much time, but I wanted to walk as much as I could so that I could eat the maximum number of blackberries. I was just drawn to them. I didn't even think about this particular book or chapter when I was doing it. But what he says is very true. We are not drawn that way to meat or blood or actually tearing of the flesh. In fact, even people that consume a lot of meat, even people that find a meat dish appetizing, they are not finding the sight of killing of the animal or just butchering it a pleasant scene. For most people, it's rather unpleasant to look at. They just want the cooked meal on their table. And neither are just leaves and grass and all of that appetizing to us. Our nose, our sight, our smell, our hearing, everything is geared towards reaching out to and seeking the sugars and the produce of the plant, which again is what he says we are meant to be eating. I'm going to move on. The last criteria that he uses is the nourishment of the young. Again, by observation, we find that milk is undoubtedly the food for the newborn babe. Abundant milk is not supplied in the breasts of a mother if she does not take fruits, grains, and vegetables as her natural food. Again, something that you can easily observe. Only when you go into that natural rhythm of the body, even a human mother is able to produce milk that is needed for her child. So with all these different observations, he concludes that this is the most natural diet for man. These observations all lead to the conclusion that various grains, fruits and roots, and for beverage, milk and pure water openly exposed to air and sun are decidedly the best natural food for man. Other foods are unnatural to man and being uncongenial to the system are necessarily foreign. Mixed with the blood, they accumulate in the excretory and other organs not properly adapted to them. So he talks about the cause of illness and disease. Again, quite summarizing all of what he's sharing here, this is the science of yoga. It is not just the philosophy of God and creation and what we are trying to do in the abstract, but what do we do on a day-to-day basis? What is the right food and why? And he moves on later on to talk about other things, the natural human instincts and how to practice the yamas and niyamas. And he says, unless we can be in tune with these natural ways of living, it is very hard for us to practice those yamas and niyamas. I'm going to say, I'll move on to the next particular topic here. He talks about passion and sexual desire, a very, very important discussion when it comes to the practice of yoga and of yamas and niyamas. He says, we find that when extraordinary means such as excessive fasting, scrounging, or monastic confinement are resorted to for the purpose of suppressing the sexual passions, these seldom produce the desired result. He is making a very, very important point. I was reading these particular sections of this chapter keenly today. He talks about man's natural desire instinct, the procreative instinct that manifests as sexual desire. And he says there is a naturalness to how one wants to seek a mate and how man also wants to procreate in that way. But it is never excessive. And he talks about the dwelling, the food, and when the company is unnatural, it produces a restlessness in the body, and it often reflects or expresses as these unnatural or excessive desires and passions. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna obviously says, when Arjuna asks this very famous question, "My Lord, why is it that sometimes I don't act in my own best interest? I do things that are self-evidently bad for me." And then Krishna says, passion it is. And that's really what Yukteswar is talking about here. It is that passion. In the West, the word passion almost is considered a virtue. When you're interviewing somebody or a resume, you can say, this individual's passionate quality, he's passionate about doing this, and that's somehow considered a virtue. Whereas in the Indian system, the word passion is not as respected or widely adored as it might be in the West, because it reflects, I'm not getting stuck on that one word, but here in this context, it reflects that fundamental restlessness that is caused because of unnatural ways of living. So he says, when we are able to live a natural life on a non-irritant diet, we gain calmness of the mind, which I'm going to read his words, which every psychologist knows is the most favorable to mental activity and to clear understanding, as well as to a judicial way of thinking. And then he moves on to sexual desire. It's harder to state it more perfectly than he says it here. I'm going to read just a few sentences here. Everyone has an accurate thermometer to indicate the condition of his health in his sexual desire. He says the sexual desire that we feel is actually an accurate thermometer to indicate the condition of one's own health. This desire is forced from its natural state by the irritation of nerves that is caused from the pressure of foreign matters, which is exerted on the sexual apparatus and is manifested as increased sexual desire followed by a gradual decrease of potency. This sexual desire makes man, in its normal state, makes man free from disturbing lusts and operates of the organism and operates on the organism only infrequently. And this is the line to really underline here, especially for those of us that are striving to lead a natural life. The desire in its natural state makes man free from disturbing lust and operates on the organism only infrequently, awakening a wish for appeasement. Again, experiment shows that this desire, like all other desire, is always normal in individuals who lead a natural life. He says it's not abnormal. Appeasement of the sexual desire is not antithetical to how humans are made or to the natural way of life. But when one feels it constantly, then there is a certain pressure exerted on their nerves because of unnatural ways of living. That's how he describes all of this. One might ask, now that's the obvious question that comes, what is normal? What is frequent or infrequent? It's a very subtle question, and it's not something I would try to answer in the next 5 minutes. But you can again look at natural cycles of life itself. The ovulation cycle in women is only once a month. Whereas, and that's, in most animals it's even less frequent. Most animals don't indulge in, as far as I know, it is said that dolphins do, I'm not sure about that, but animals don't indulge in sexual activity for pleasure. They only indulge in it for procreation, and they are in tune with the natural cycle. Man, on the other hand, because again of his unnatural ways of living, he's out of tune with that natural cycle. We don't have any natural cyclical way of expressing the sexuality. Man has a desire. When I say man, I'm referring to both genders. The human being has a desire, and they seek fulfillment for that desire through that sexual means. But it does not follow any natural cycle, and it's certainly not driven by the desire to procreate. Now, what is the natural cycle? Without going into further detail, you can even look at the natural cycle of ovulation in the human female, which is only once a month, or even the cycle of childbearing, which is about 9 months, which means it takes that much time in order to even procreate. Then a higher frequency of feeling that desire or needing to exert that is a sign of irritation of the nerves. Moving on, I'm going to skip these few paragraphs here. Just to touch on the last 2 points he says here, this is all about the right living and right food. The other 2 points he made that were related in this particular context are right dwelling and right company. I will read briefly what he says here. Again, wonderful to contemplate, and I am not sure how practical for each one of us, but just important to remember. We can easily understand when we feel displeasure on entering a crowded room after breathing fresh air on a mountaintop or an expansive field or garden. I just love how scientific he is. He's not making any assumptions. He's not giving any abstraction. He just says, just feel it. Walk into a crowded place, especially, I grew up in India, maybe some of you watching this or have at least traveled in India or live in India. You can easily imagine just traveling in public transport or being in a crowded place, how suffocating it is, how claustrophobic sometimes when you're in these narrow spaces or streets that are very crowded, and how unnatural it feels in comparison to being on a mountaintop or in an expansive field. So that should tell you, your own feeling of the heart that you feel when you walk into the space should tell you what is more natural for us. And he moves on to say, the fresh atmosphere of the mountaintop or of a field or a garden or of a dry place under trees covering a large plot of land freely ventilated with fresh air is the natural dwelling place of man according to his nature. I love how many times the word nature occurs in this section and in this chapter of the book, because we are not trying to create a rule, we are just observing. We are observing to see what works, what makes us happy, what makes our body healthy, and what gives us comfortable living. So all of that is part of our own nature. That's why we are talking about natural food, natural living, natural dwelling, and finally, natural company. Here also, he says, if we listen to the dictates of our conscience and consult our natural liking, we will at once find that we favor those people whose magnetism affects us harmoniously, who cool our system internally, invigorate our vitality, develop our natural love, and thus relieve us of our miseries and administer peace to us. Again, a lot of qualities. Just to observe, it is not so much the quality of the person themselves, but what you get in that exchange. Just think of being with a friend. And sometimes satsang is more than just being physically with somebody. Even the kind of company you keep in terms of the vibration, where you live, what you watch on Netflix or YouTube or wherever it is, what kind of music do you listen to, what kind of books do you read. These are also vibrationally the company that you keep, even what kind of art you have in your place, because you're inviting that vibration, that particular person into your room. And how do they make you feel? Do they make you feel in all these different ways? Harmonious, cooling your system, invigorating your vitality, developing your natural love. So all of these are ways in which we can test and see whether this is right company for me, whether this is the right natural company, because again, sometimes that restlessness leads us to even seek things that are bad for us. Again, that's what goes back to the verse from the Bhagavad Gita. Why do I do things that are self-evidently bad? Why do I listen to heavy metal music? Why do I keep scrolling my phone and watching silly things that are not really uplifting for me? Why do I read, just biased news that is constantly polarizing people and I cannot stop reading it? We are drawn to things despite knowing that it may not be good for our conscience because of that underlying restlessness. And we can fix it through natural food and natural dwelling, but also just paying attention to what kind of company that we are keeping and just shifting that. Why am I keeping this company? I am aware that scrolling through Instagram on my phone is not going to make me uplifted. So why not just go listen to some uplifting music or speak to somebody whose company I enjoy or read a spiritual book? That is the natural company that my soul is seeking. So finally, he concludes this section on page number 70. I just quickly brushed through all those pages because I guess I was trying to finish it in this particular morning session. Natural living is helpful for the practice of yama, the ascetic forbearances, as explained earlier. Purity of mind and body being equally important in the practice of niyama, the ascetic observance is already explained. Every attempt should be made to attain that purity. So he says, yamas and niyamas, you can affirm these qualities as you do in your daily life, but what will really help you achieve them is natural living. So, friends, I know that was very fast and I covered a lot of things, but hopefully you found some things useful there, and certainly I would recommend you read these pages from the book in order to get a deeper understanding of what Yukteswar Giri is sharing. I will see you again next week. Until then, God bless you.